Okay, so I just had to click the record button. It is my pleasure to introduce Brandon Spars, who will be the MC for the Do Tell Story Swap section of this celebration. Brandon is a storyteller in his own right, having been a 5-time winner of Bay Area Moss Story Slam competitions, including 2 Grand Slams. Perhaps Brandon will weave some tales into his MC duties. So I need to take the spotlight off of me and find Brandon. Oh my goodness.
I'm here, I'm here.
There you are, there you are.
Can everybody see me?
No.
Now they can.
That's good.
Okay, take it away.
Wow. What an honor to be the MC for Do Tell in Santa Rosa in this joint celebration with Inland Valley. Thank you very much, John. My name is Brandon. I've been telling or performing stories publicly for about 8 years. But really it began more than 20 years ago in my classroom where I told myths and legends from all over the world. And then I started telling personal stories that related to the places I traveled. And during those personal stories, I really began to connect to the material I was teaching. And in a way that a storyteller connects to the audience, I started to connect to my students. It was actually a fellow teacher who encouraged me to try telling outside of the classroom. He was a stand-up comedian, and he dragged me from bar to bar doing open mics. You get 3 minutes. So I followed him around and watched him perform at the Hot Monk, the Toad in the Hole, Doc Holiday's, the Zoo, and many other of Sonoma County's finest establishments. But after 6 months of watching him, I finally did perform. But it was right around that time that I also saw an article in Storytelling magazine about story swaps. And I realized this is what I was missing. The first to welcome me when I showed up at the Do Tell Story Swap was none other than our next teller, Katie Mangan, who is one of the coordinators. She has told stories throughout her entire life. The inspiration of her stories comes from observing the seasons, birds, and animals. She tells stories at social gatherings, including seasonal celebrations and birthdays. And also she does an Art on the Ridge program. It is such an honor to introduce Katie Mangan from Do Tell.
No. I'm over here. Oh no. Oh shit.
What happened, Katie?
I don't know. I just lost my oh gosh. I lost my picture. I mean, my picture wasn't up there. I don't know. What should I do now?
We can see you,
Oh, you can
so
see me.
you can
Okay.
proceed.
Okay, so shall I just start? I'm so sorry about that.
You're fine. Go for it.
Okay.
That's a great traditional beginning for a story, by the way.
Write that down.
No, oh shit, perfect.
I am so sorry. Many apologies. I'm so happy to be here. When Eduardo was 18 years old, he left home and he hit the open road searching for adventure. But it was a much more difficult thing to do than he'd ever thought. It was, and he one day was trying to find a place to spend the night. And he asked a farmer, "Oh, my boy, you should go to the Abbey. Oh, the brothers will look after you there. 3 nights, free lodging, 3 meals a day, dry place to sleep. Off you go now. Well, the abbey looked very formidable and very austere, but he went up to the door and rang the bell. Eventually, one of the monks came and opened the door and ushered him in. Eduardo followed him down a long and drafty corridor. And then there was another bell. And the monk quickened his pace, and they found themselves in a big dining hall, rows of long tables with benches on either side. And this is where they sat and had their evening meal in silence. And then after the meal, they went to the chapel. Now, the chapel was a pleasant surprise to Eduardo. The walls were beautifully decorated with scenes of the abbey grounds and the gardens, of saints, of past abbots. And he just sat there and listened to the monks praying, and then they began to chant. It was the most magical sound to him, and he allowed the waves of peace to just wash over him. And so it was after the 3 days that he went to the abbot and asked if he could stay and join the abbey and become a novice. Well, the abbot was delighted. He could see that Eduardo was smart, he was well educated, and he was a hard worker. Eduardo spent his days working in the fields and in the gardens, and he also learned the laws of obedience to the abbey and to loyalty to the abbot. But you know, he'd been there for almost a year, and he was beginning to tire of the life. He longed for some contact with the outside world, and he also didn't like the fact that the bells were ruling his life. The abbot could see something was wrong and asked him about it. Now, instead of being honest with the abbot, Eduardo said the first thing that came into his head, which was, the fruit trees needed pruning. Well, the abbot did not have time for that. And he suggested to Eduardo that he ask some of the migrant farm workers as they were passing through the abbey on their way home from working in the fields all summer, if maybe 1 or 2 of them could help. But he warned Eduardo that amongst the group of farm workers and the pilgrims, there were a few very dangerous men. They always traveled alone. You see, they were storytellers. And the abbot knew from past experience that a good story could turn the most devout brother off his spiritual path and back out into the outside world of sin. My son, never listen to the stories. Well, Eduardo found 3 workers, farm workers, who were good at pruning trees, and they set to work. And they were so thrilled to have one last paying seasonal job. And they wanted to give him a thank you. And they weren't quite sure how they would do that. But they got their opportunity about a week later. They very excitedly told Eduardo that the previous evening, a man had told them a wonderful story. But Eduardo shook his head. He was being loyal to the abbot. Well, the next day, they told him that the man had told another great story, and that that night would be the last night that the storyteller would be here, and he had saved his very best story until last. And so that evening, Eduardo found his way into the darkest shadows, close to where the storyteller would be telling his story. He could hear the man clear his throat and laughed. Okay, I see all your smiling faces, yes. Oh, and some that are hidden. Eduardo held his breath. And then the man launched into this amazing story of how he took a journey south several years previously. So vivid was the descriptions of the road, Eduardo felt a map had just been rolled out in front of him. They were traveling south to a tropical forest known as the Emerald Forest. Eduardo could hear the roar of the waterfalls. He could hear the monkeys chattering in the trees, the parrots flying overhead and squawking. He could smell the exotic plants and flowers. So vivid were the descriptions that as they walked towards a village, they could hear the villagers singing and they could hear them dancing. And as they round that final corner, it was the bell to chapel. Eduardo was so torn. He knew he should go to chapel, but he wanted to hear the rest of the story. But finally, he did leave. And he did go to chapel, and he was dreadfully late. The brothers had finished praying, and they were now chanting. It was the smell of the incense that reminded Eduardo of the exotic flowers in the tropical forest. And within the chant, he could hear the roar of the waterfall. He could hear the monkeys and the parrots. As he looked up at the chapel ceiling, he saw vines falling down and growing up the walls and across the floor. He was back in the Emerald Forest. How long he was there, he didn't know. But when he returned to the chapel, it was cold and damp. The next day, he went to the Abbott and told him he was leaving. He was traveling south to the tropical Emerald Forest. Well, the Abbot was disappointed and sad to see him go. But to his credit, he gave him a pair of stout sandals, a change of clothes, and some money for the journey. Suffice it to say, Eduardo had many adventures on his road south, and many more in the forest itself. He stayed there for a few years, and then he moved on. He got married, he settled down, and had a family. And it was his third child, a son, Patrick, who was a musical prodigy. And at the age of 18, Patrick left home to go and study under a master of music. And on his way to the master's house, he passed a small monastery. And he'd heard so many stories from his father about his life in the abbey that Patrick decided to go to the front door of the monastery and ring the bell. He was invited in, shown a small and simple guest room. He joined the monks for a meal in silence, and then they went to the chapel. The monks prayed, and then they began to chant. Oh, Patrick could not believe his ears. He knew that chant. It was one his father had sung to them as babies, as children. And they could hear him chanting when he worked in the gardens and the fields. And so Patrick joined in. He had a rich and deep voice. So beautiful was his voice that the monks began to chant softer and softer till finally they just stopped chanting and listened to him. And when he'd finished, well, the monks left. But Patrick stayed in the chapel and let the waves of peacefulness just flow over him. But then he realized somebody was watching him. And he turned and he saw an old monk. My son, who taught you that chant? And so Patrick explained about his father Eduardo spending a year in an abbey. And the old monk nodded and smiled. My son, when you next write to your father, remember me to him, for I was that abbot. And Patrick took the old man's hand in his and smiled. father. Eduardo, my father, has never forgotten you. Blessings, abundance, and healing to you all.
Oh, Katie, thank you for that. Yes, storytellers are dangerous. They're dangerous to the audience. They inspire the listener. And of course, they can even seduce the listener. Now, in my case, telling stories was dangerous, but not to the audience. It was dangerous to me. I mean, physically dangerous, as you will hear in a little bit. At the bar Spanky's, a biker bar, I finally figured I was ready to try a 3-minute story. My colleague had mentioned there was no pressure here, mainly because nobody would even be listening to me. In fact, they wouldn't notice if I were good or bad. That's because the stage I would be on faced the bar, which meant you told stories to the line of backs of people who were drinking at the bar. Now, the best indication of what this was like, this bar, was the bathroom itself. It had no door. It was a room with a toilet. And if you wanted privacy, you simply turned the light out. The nice thing about coming to our swap in Santa Rosa was that A, we have a door on our bathroom, and B, we listen to each other, but it's a nice supportive kind of listening where there is very little pressure. I've become a good listener, and there is nobody I would rather listen to than Sharon Elwell, our next teller. She is a lifelong educator, and of course, she filled her classrooms with stories. She loves to tell stories to her grandchildren, and of course, us at the Do Tell Swap. She understands that connection between storytelling and teaching. Please welcome Sharon Elwell.
There, I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Hoping you hear me.
We hear you. You're on. You're on
Yes.
spotlight.
Oh, good. Okay. I want to tell you about a place not far from here, but it's a place where the culture and customs are nothing like yours and mine. It's a place where the language is not understood by anybody except those who are inhabitants of this place. It's a dangerous place. People who go there go with some fear and trembling. People who leave there leave with relief. And I know because I've been there. And you've been there too. The name of the place is 7th grade. And for most people, 7th grade is just a bump on the road back to civilization. But a 7th grade teacher has to serve a little bit longer sentence than that. Of course, there are compensations. For instance, there's this beautiful rose, which one Pablo, well, he stole it from the centerpiece in the teacher's room, but he gave it to me, and it's the thought that counts. And then there's the remarkable improvement that Osvaldo made in his math. On the math test, he got 18 questions in a row perfectly right. But on question 19, he wrote, "Answers may vary." So I was a little startled by that and went to his desk. And sure enough, the library had accidentally issued him a teacher's copy of the text. And then there are things like what you learn about logic from talking to someone like Alejandra about gum. she said to me, "Yes, that's my gum. I bought it with my own money. I didn't steal that gum. I bought it at the Chevron on the way to school." Well, no, that doesn't mean I'm going to chew it. I wouldn't chew gum at school. We have a rule about that. Oh, well, yes, that's my desk. You know that's my desk. No, nobody ever sits there but me, but that doesn't mean that glob of gum under there belongs to me. I don't understand why you try to get me in trouble all the time. Why does everybody always want me to be in trouble? My head was spinning. And then there came the matter of the paper clips. Now, you may not think that a paper clip is a dangerous object. You would never hear somebody say, "Open up your backpack, I need to see if you have any paper clips." But if you fold it out like this, a paper clip is a 7th grader's #1 weapon. With a paper clip like this, you can poke a hole in your water bottle and turn it into a squirt gun. You can write your boyfriend's name on your arm. You could just stab somebody. But the story I want to tell you about tonight involved poor Daniel and his paper clip. Daniel had a terrible crush on Elia. She sat behind him, and he had no reason to think that she liked him. Every once in a while, she'd knot up a piece of paper into a ball and lob it at the back of his head. But there was nothing personal about that. It was just the closest head. But one day, Elia took the trackball out of the computer mouse and threw that at the back of Daniel's head, taking their relationship to a whole new level. And Daniel, who was so excited about this show of interest, grabbed his handy paperclip and turned around to mark his territory by scraping Elia on the arm from elbow to hand. Unfortunately, this action did not have the desired result. Daniel was in a lot of trouble with Elia and with me, and eventually with his mother. And when I asked him about it later, "Daniel, what in the world were you thinking?" He said, "It's my pants." And what could there possibly be a connection between pants and that happening? And he said, "These are my bad luck pants. Every time I wear these pants, I get into terrible trouble. The last time I wore them, I got in trouble in Mr. Adams' class for talking when he was trying to teach us something." "Well, were you talking?" "Well, yes, I was, but I wouldn't have been caught if I didn't have the bad luck pants on. And then the next time I got in trouble for trying to chew gum during band. It must be awfully hard to play a trombone and chew gum at the same time." "Oh, it is, but I could have done it if I didn't have these bad luck pants on." And he said, "And now this, my mother's going to be really upset. I only have 2 pairs of pants. And if I wear the other ones every single day, she's going to have to do a lot more laundry. But I can't help it. I'll never wear these pants again. They're just too dangerous." And then, of course, I got this cootie catcher. You may be too old to remember what a cootie catcher looks like, but there is one, and it had a message for me in it. And this message is one of the favorite things from the 7th graders. It says, "Dear Mrs. Elwell, I love you. You are my favorite teacher. You will always be my favorite, even though everybody else knows you're boring. There's just nothing like 7th grade."
Let's see. I unmuted myself. Thank you very much. That was great. It reminded me of some of my teaching experiences as well. So now I'm going to introduce one of the storytellers from Inland Valley Storytelling, and it's supposed to be Ron Evans, and I saw Janet Evans, his wife, just logged in, so I'm assuming Ron is using her computer. I can find him or find her. Janet, where did you go? Ah, there we are. There we are. Okay, so do you know how to unmute yourself?
Yep, unmuted.
You're unmuted. Okay, so I want to introduce Ron Evans, who is there in the video that you can see. And he's a native New Englander who is a retired clergyman. Ron joined the Inland Valley Storytellers in 2009 and has performed in most of the IVS concerts since the spring concert of 2009. And he and his wife, Janet, have a very special distinction. They were present for the very first Tellabration, which was founded in Connecticut in 1988. So please welcome Ron Evans.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry for the false start and having to run around and tell a lot of people that we couldn't find you, and then they couldn't find me, and here we are. But someday it'll make a good story, I suppose. 102 years ago, tomorrow, the Great War, World War I, ended. People of my generation celebrate that as Armistice Day, now referred to often as Veterans Day, and appropriately so. It was the period of time when everything changed, and some things haven't improved. An enormous division of forces and of ideas and ideals. And as most people have witnessed again, a time of great division continues. But there's a poetic reference to the hope that no matter what divides us, one day there will be a time that we are again at one. The notion of the lion who will lie down with the lamb, a hope for peace and tranquility, even in the most absurd of circumstances. Was it that great theologian Woody Allen who said the lion and the lamb may take a nap sometime together, but only one of them will rest peacefully? But we all have greater hopes. And perhaps even the absurd can become a reality. I'm not sure, but within my lifetime at least, an ocean away from here, there were two men. Each was the product of a remarkable family of means and ability. The fathers of each of these lads were in the diplomatic corps, and both lived in various cities in Europe and became fluent in several different languages. Each of these boys went to school in Great Britain, what they call public school, one to Eton, one to Harrow, and one to Oxford and one to Cambridge, though they had never met. And so it was that one of these was recruited, in fact, for one and for the other. You see, each had a great devotion to his own family and to his country. But the problem was that the countries to which they were devoted were at war with each other. One Great Britain and one Nazi Germany. And so, after great training and concentration, one of these two was informed and educated and trained in the purposes and practices and all the details of the ways of the high command in Berlin of the Nazi army. The idea was that he would become one day a spy, and if need be, would be sent behind enemy lines to determine what information would be of value to the Allied forces. And so in the spring of 1944, so it was that he was sent to France. The ruse was that he had come from occupying a force in Norway, and that he was now a German officer and was transferred to a small area just inside Vichy, France, to try to meet up with another man who was a Nazi officer, in fact, and whom the Allies knew to have very high connection in Berlin and with the German high command. And so with 3 bottles of a very fine Napoleon brandy, of which the German officer, it was determined long in advance, had a particular passion for. 3 bottles liberated from some Vichy officer in Paris, so the fellow said. They found each other late one night in a little bistro in this small town. And so it was that though they'd never met, they both had the same rank and had served in far reaches of the war, came to know each other as they consumed first one and then the second, and well into the 3rd bottle of the cognac. Well, the idea was to try to find out from this German officer how much they knew about the sure to come at some point or other invasion of Europe. What we now know was the D-Day invasion, and then only the code name Overlord, Operation Overlord. Well, through their carousing and drinking, with great subtlety and care, it did become revealed that this German officer, in fact, did hear rumors of the interest that the high command did have in the invasion, of course, and knew that it was coming. And sometime fairly soon, not exactly when, but did not know where. Oh, there were many who argued the Normandy coast, but most said somewhere farther north, perhaps in Holland. And so though the Normandy coast would be far preferable, it seemed too obvious. And so it was dismissed. Well, with that knowledge in hand, and also with the remarkable bit of information that he did not know, that the German officer's wife and son had been lost in the bombing of Dresden, just as indeed the British officer's wife and 2 young daughters had been lost in the bombing of London. So it was a particularly deep and secret thought. But finally, by dawn's early light, it was time to end this, and both a little wobbly on their feet, got up, and with the obligatory Heil Hitler to each, they departed the cafe. One going in one direction to meet up with his unit, the other in the other direction to ostensibly meet up with his. Satisfied that he did have the information and that there was a plan by which he would make his way to the Resistance, the French underground, who would get that word to London no matter what happened to him. He reached within the folds of his well-tailored, bemetaled German uniform for a part of the plan which was his own and personal and insistent, and reached for his German Luger and pulled it out. And then, and only then, did he realize that for the last hour or more, both men had been conversing not in German, but in English. And he turned around, and there, not 10 yards away, was the officer, the German officer, with his hand up extended and a big smile on his face. His hand not in the obligatory Heil, but rather slowly up and around with that tempered steel salute of the then British Empire. And then reached behind and pulled out his gun and both men dove, one into the brushes, one into a doorway, picked himself up, staggered with a fractured arm, and ran and ran and ran and ran, not knowing what had happened to the other. And so it was. And neither knew that the other had survived. And neither knew what ultimately happened to the other. And neither, of course, ever met again. At least not for 50 years, haunted by that strange meeting and late night encounter. But they were reunited. When both appeared in Geneva, Switzerland, at the invitation of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, where both men would divide and split evenly a reward only once before bestowed by the High Commissioner for the work that they had done to honor them, each. And what was it? That for the remainder of their professional lives, each one, unbeknownst to the other, had devoted the greater part of an extremely significant family fortune and all of his energies to the work of restoration for the British officer, widows and children in Germany and Poland and France, for the Nazi officer, for British and French widows and children. Lion and lamb, just a bit of romantic poetry and imagery and maybe a desperate hope, or maybe ultimately, possibly more greatly still, the reality of one day seeing that we do in fact have more in common than ever we can have in conflict. And so that we can all work with that hope for a world which is not just for some of us, but truly just for all of us. A world without famine or fears or fighting. A world at one with itself and with all therein contained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That was great. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so our next teller is Adrian Lowry, and she has been a storyteller since the first day they let her stand in front of a captive audience of freshman writing students while working on her PhD at USC in the 1990s. But a more formal storyteller with more willing audiences over the last 20 years. Adrian joined the Inland Valley Storytellers in 2011 and has performed in every IVS concert since the spring concert of 2012. Please welcome Adrian Lowry, and I will try to spotlight her. There we go.
Oh, almost.
I hear you.
Let's see, am I spotlighted? Okay.
Yes, you are.
Okay, I don't see myself. Well, I have for you a 19th century Russian folktale from Arthur Ransom's Old Peter collection of stories. This is The Little Daughter of the Snow. There was an old man and an old woman who lived in a hut in a village on the edge of the forest. Well, quite a village it was. 8 huts at least, about 30 or 40 souls that lived there. Oh, but the old man and the old woman, unfortunately, were just not happy. You see, they had no little Vanya and no little Marussia in order to fill their lives. They would watch out their windows and see all the children playing in the street. All the other huts in the village had children, had babies in them, but theirs had none. They had dogs and a cat and roosters and hens, but that never made up for them not having children. Oh, they longed for it. They watched the children play on a daily basis out in the street. And they would see them running and throwing snowballs and then rolling up the snow in order to make a snow woman, a regular Baba Yaga, a snow witch. The old man turned to his wife and said, "Wife, why don't we go out in the yard and make a snow girl, and perhaps she will come alive and be our daughter?" "Husband," said the old woman, "you never know what can be. Let us go and make a little snow girl." So out into the yard they went, and they rolled up the snow, and they put it together, and they very tenderly rolled up the snow for the legs and for her arms, and pretty soon she was quite beautiful as a birch in spring. Well, it was twilight, and she was done, and her little white eyes stood there blank, and her little cold lips stayed still and silent. "Won't you speak to us?" said the old woman. "Oh, won't you run and play like the children?" said the old man. And she did. You know, she really did. They could see in the twilight her eyes were as blue as a spring sky, and her lips had a flush to them, and they opened and parted in a smile. And she had long black hair that flew in the wind as she twirled and whirled like a snowflake on the wind. She laughed, she danced, and she sang the song, "No warm blood in me doth glow, water in my veins doth flow, yet I'll laugh and sing and play by frosty night and frosty day, little daughter of the snow. But whenever I do know that you love me little, then I shall melt away again, back into the sky I'll go, little daughter of the snow." "Oh, isn't she beautiful?" said the old man. And he picked her up. She put her little cold arms around him. She said, "Now don't get me too warm." And she laughed in his ear. They brought her into the hut and sat her on a bench farthest from the stove, while the old woman made her a coat, and they dressed her in a fur hat and red boots with fur tops on them. "Oh, too hot, too hot," she said. "I need to go out into the cool night." But but no," said the old woman. "You need to stay inside and sleep." And the little girl said, "No, I'll go play frosty night and frosty day." And out she ran into the snow, laughing. Well, they watched and they watched and they watched all through the night until uh, they had to go to bed finally. But I'll tell you, several times through the night, the old man got up and looked out the window to see if she was still there. And she was. And she was dancing and singing and laughing in the snow and chasing her shadow on the cold snow with the moonlight and throwing snowballs at the stars. And when dawn came, she came into the house and had her breakfast with the old woman and the old man. She had ice porridge all crushed up in a little wooden bowl. And that day she went out, played with the children out in the street. And oh, she could run faster than any of them, and she could throw snowballs better than any of them. And whenever they made a little old woman out of snow, she laughed and she laughed like peals on bells of glass. Oh, how proud the old man and the old woman were. She's really ours, said the old woman. Our own little one, said the old man. Well, this went on throughout the winter. She would play all day and come in for her ice porridge and then go out into the snow and play all day in the snow or all night in the snow. And then at dawn, she would come in and have her ice porridge and go out and play again with the children. And on one of those beautiful days when the snow was beginning to melt, the children went to the forest to play. And of course, the little snow girl came along. They'd have it no other way. They never could remember how they ever played without her. And they laughed and they went too far into the forest and began to turn back. But the little snow girl said, no, and she tossed her head and ran further into the forest. They called after her, but didn't want to follow her. They were too afraid. And after a while, they waited, and well, she didn't come back, and it was getting dark. So they headed back to the huts and ran as the gathering dusk got darker and darker, holding one another's hands. Well, the little daughter of snow looked around and saw no one else around her. She climbed a tree to see if she could see them. I, little friends, have pity on a little snow girl. But no one answered her, except an old red fox who came by and called up to her, oh, my dear, what are you crying about? Well, old fox, I'm lost. I've lost my way. It's getting dark and my friends are all gone and I don't know how to get home. Well, I'll take you home, said the fox. And so she scrambled down from the tree, held onto his tail as they ran through the forest in the dark, and soon enough they were at the lighted door of the hut of the old man and the old woman, who were inside lamenting and crying that she was gone. Here I am, she said. The old red fox has brought me home. Oh, thank you so much, said the old man. Oh, you must be hungry, said the old woman. Well, here's a bread crust for you. Well, said the fox, I would really like to have a nice plump hen. I mean, isn't your little daughter of snow worth a plump hen? Well, of course, said the old woman. But she grumbled to her husband, we have our daughter back. Why should we give up one of our plump hens? I agree, said the old man. I have an idea, said the old woman. And she told him what she planned to do, and he went out and got 2 sacks. So they took the sacks out into the front of the house and they called the fox to come out. And just as the fox was about to seize the hen they released from the first sack, they opened the second sack, and the fiercest of their dogs ran out, and the fox was so scared he headed straight into the forest without looking back and had no hen at all. Well done, said the old man. Well done, said the old woman. Now we have our daughter and we have our plump hen. And at that moment, they heard the little daughter of snow singing in the hut. Old ones, now I know you love me less than a hen. I shall go away again. Goodbye, oh ancient ones, goodbye. Back I go across the sky. To my mother kin I go, little daughter of the snow. No, don't go, they cried out. Well, they could see the little pool of water in front of the stove where her little boots, her little fur hat, and her coat were. And they could hear her laughing as the wind whipped open the door of the hut, and out the little daughter of snow leapt into the arms of Frost, her father, and Snow, her mother, and they took her over the North Sea, where she plays on the frozen seas during the summer, and in the winters she comes back to Russia. And the old man and the old woman hoped that one day, when they might be out making a snow woman, that maybe their little snow daughter would be there instead. Oh, that's a lovely thought, said the old woman. And the old man thought for a moment. Yes, and I would love her much more than a hen.
Thank you, Adrian. That was a really wonderful story. And Mr. Evans, I really enjoyed yours before that. It's really nice to see tellers from another swap, and I certainly hope we can do this again. Well, at Spanky's Biker Bar, it was finally my turn to get up to the open mic and tell my 3-minute story. I was going to tell a story about a monkey that I had an encounter with in Sumatra. I noticed all the backs were turned to me. Even the man who introduced me, the MC, was at the bar drinking, not listening. The light was out in the bathroom, and sure enough, there was an enormous shadow of a man hunched over the toilet. I was efficiently making my way through my first performance. I was doing it. And that was when this desire began to well up inside of me. This desire to be heard and to connect with the people in my audience. That's something I've really enjoyed most about our swap, and I can see it's true about yours as well. Connecting through stories. That's a relationship that I have come to really cherish. And we are all in our swap connected to this next teller, Robin Wheeldon. She is a storyteller, artist, mother, and very active in her community. She's a member of the board of the Storytelling Association of California. Please welcome Robin Wheeldon.
Robin needs to start her video.
Yeah, I don't see her in the list though. Is it
Well,
RD?
her name is there, but there's no video.
Why do I not see Robin? There she is, Wheeldon.
Yeah, it says she's connecting to the audio now, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Robin, can you hear us?
Put it in the chat, Robin.
Oh, there we go.
Well, John, shall I go ahead and introduce the next teller?
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
Okay, very good.
Go ahead.
So, of course, if you had heard Robin's story, you would have heard amazing sound effects, and I hope we get to hear those. My story would just need one sound effect, and that's the sound of a toilet flushing, and I'm not sure how I would do that. Now, before I took the stage, my teacher colleague had already gone, and he had a very special technique for Spanky's Biker Bar. To get his audience to actually acknowledge him, he would preface his prize jokes with a question. He would take the microphone and ask, "Now, who in here likes to drink?" And he would get their attention long enough to slip in an edgy joke. And so my desire to be heard and to connect with this audience. As I spoke to their backs, it caused me to stop and give it a try. I actually asked, who in here likes to drink? And there was very little acknowledgement of that. I added a variation in the line. Who in here wants to hear about the monkey? Now, a few people turned around at that. I'm pretty sure this was the first time they had heard about a monkey. Yeah, nobody had been listening. Except for one person, the hulking shadow on the toilet. And this is where we need the sound effect of a toilet flushing. Now, thank you, whoever did that, that was great. And now he was emerging, holding his trousers with one unwashed hand at the level of his thighs, holding a roll of toilet paper with the other unwashed hand. Everyone looked at him. I remained totally silent. He looked at me, and then he put his other hand to his mouth and shouted, "Boo!" and chucked the toilet paper right at me. The audience sprang into action, grabbing anything they could find, peanuts, beer cans, and in a shower of garbage, I jumped off the stage and ran toward the exit. Passing my colleague, he shouted, "I'll call you." Well, to this very day, I have felt very unwelcome in Spanky's Biker Bar. I don't dare return. But of course, at our swap, it's just the opposite. I've always felt welcome. And no one comes to our swap and doesn't get a big warm welcome from our next teller. She is a co-founder of our swap, along with a man named Kenneth Foster. This is probably between 10 and 15 years ago. And she has been a professional storyteller since 1994. She's had audiences ranging from San Francisco all the way to Shanghai, China. I am so honored to introduce Elaine Stanley.
Hi. I was born in Virginia, but I left when I was about 3 months old. Oh, not on my own. My father was in the Air Force. And so I spent my entire growing up life moving on average every 2 years. I lived across the United States in several states. I lived in London, England, and I graduated from high school in Tokyo, Japan, at an American government high school. And then after 4 years in Japan, they shipped my father back to the States with the family, and we were on a ship. Crossed the international date line on my 20th birthday, which means that I actually celebrated my 20th birthday 2 days in a row, which might make me about 20 years older than I am right now. But anyway, we got to San Francisco and I said to my dad, you know, I want to go and find myself. He says, you don't need finding, you're standing right here. I said, no. You know, I mean, I'm not ready to get a job or go to college. I want to figure out what I want to do with my life. He said, you've had 20 years to do that. You figure it out on your own, but what did you have in mind? And I said, well, you know, when I meet people, they say, where are you from? And I either say where I last lived or where I was born. And if I say I was, you know, I'm from Virginia, I don't know what Virginia looks like. I've never been there. I mean, 3 months old, I was there, but I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how it is. And he said, I said, I want to go back and see what my birth state looks like and maybe see if I have a life there. And he said, well, I tell you what, I'll give you your inheritance early, or part of it at least. And you can go and have all the fun you want. But when the money runs out, don't come back for more. You got to get a job, girl. I said, okay. And so the next morning, he gave me a nice wad of money, a nice chunk of money. And I went, oh boy, what's the cheapest way to get to Virginia? How can I get there besides walking, which I'd never make? I know, I'll catch a Greyhound bus. Well, I caught a Greyhound bus, and a Greyhound bus stops, feels like it stops every 15 minutes. But it was day after day, and it felt like 10 years, but I finally arrived in Virginia. And I don't know if you've ever seen Virginia, but it's really a beautiful state. And running down the western side of the state are the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I looked at those mountains, and they weren't as craggy and beautiful as the Sierras, but they were beautiful. And I said, you know, I bet I could get an old cabin up there, learn to live off the land. I might never, ever have to go to get a job or go to college. I hate school anyway. This is perfect. So I went and talked to a realtor who was willing to show this young 20-year-old kid around the mountains. And sure enough, we found a place. Well, it was a cute little cabin, I thought, but it was probably more of a shack than a cabin, but it had a brick fireplace. And I was sold. So I bought the cabin, and I bought some tools for gardening. I bought all the fishing gear I'd need and a rifle and ammunition, and I was set. Well, it probably took me 2 years to really learn how to fish, so that when I went out, I knew when I came back, I'd have fish on the table and fish in the freezer for later. And I found out living off the land is not easy. In fact, it was a lot of hard work. And I learned the hard way because every time I planted crop, I lost it before I learned how you have to put down wire and cover things with wire, because everything in your yard comes in to eat what you are growing. But I finally started getting pretty good food from the garden, and the fishing was getting better so that I knew what time of the day, what time of the year, where the fish were running. And it probably took me 3 years to learn how to hunt, to the point where when I went out, I knew I'd come back with meat for the table. And so one fine fall morning, I woke up, I walked out, and oh, it was a beautiful day. It was crystal clear blue sky with little puffy white clouds. It was fall like this, and the air was cool and crisp and beautiful. And the leaves were all turning colors. They were orange, yellow, red, purple, green, beautiful leaves. And as I started out the front door, after grabbing that gun off the stone fireplace and throwing it over my shoulder, I headed out down the path. Well, it was one of those days that was so clear, so crystal, it felt like you could see forever. And the light, the sunlight shining through those colored leaves was like light through a cathedral window. It was beautiful. And so I was kind of humming to myself and stomping down the path, just soaking in this day, when I looked over to my left and I saw a pheasant. I swung back really fast, pointed my gun, bam, I shot. Doggone, I missed. Oh, well, I had all day. Threw the gun over my shoulder, stopped humming, because you can't hunt that way. Nothing comes out when you're making noise. And I started just walking and enjoying the day. About an hour later, I saw this little rabbit off to my right. I turned real fast, bam, I shot. Doggone, I missed. Oh, and then I took stock. I checked, I went, oh my God, I didn't put any ammunition in my pockets. Oh no, I checked the gun, there was one bullet left. Well, I stood in the middle of that trail, in the middle of that woods, that forest, and I said my mantra: the next thing I shoot at, I will hit. The very next thing I shoot at, I will hit. I must have said it over 10 or 15 times, like a mantra, quietly getting the view in my head of what was going to happen. And then I started moving down that path, so stealth-like you could not hear a twig or leaf crack beneath my great big hunkin' hiking boots. I was like the wind, invisible, moving through that forest so silent, you'd never know I was there. And I looked off to my left, and there was a buck deer with a rack of antlers so big I had never seen a rack of antlers with that many points. I didn't know how I could hold his head up, but it was fabulous. I brought the gun up slowly. I took a bead on that animal, but before I shot, I heard a noise off to my right. I looked to the right, and there come a black bear through the forest. Well, it didn't seem right to leave the deer or the bear. I looked back and forth, back and forth. It wouldn't be right to leave either one. I had to have both. I reached into my waistband and pulled out a hunting knife. I threw the hunting knife at an elm tree right before me. I took aim at that knife blade and I shot. Bam! The bullet hit that knife blade and split right in two, one half killing the bear and the other half killing the deer. Woohoo! I could not believe my luck. Oh, it was amazing. But that wasn't the half of it. Why, the sheer force of that bullet hitting the knife blade knocked that knife out of the tree and sent it spinning up in the air like a big old helicopter blade, just as a flock of ducks was flying overhead. That knife killed, cleaned, and dressed 7 of those ducks before falling back to earth, point first, killing a rabbit. Whew, I could not believe it. I went running over to check my deer when I tripped over a turtle and fell head first into the creek. And then, sputtering, I came up going, and I looked over, and sure enough, that turtle was on his back. Good thing, because turtle soup in the fall is really good. And then it took me 20 minutes or more to get out of that creek because my boots were so full of trout. Well, I spent the rest of the day packing up my catch. But you know, it weren't a bad day's catch for only having 1 bullet left. That was a personal tale dovetailed with an old Ozark tall tale called 1 Bullet Left. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try Robin again. I can't even unmute her. Well, I guess we're going to have to go on. So if Robin shows up, we'll hear her story later, I guess. I don't know what's happened. So the next storyteller is Nick Smith. And Nick is a teller of historical tales for adults and traditional tales for all ages. For many years, he was the leader of the San Gabriel Valley Storytellers in Los Angeles County. Nick became an active member of Inland Valley Storytellers in 2004, and with his many years of experience organizing storytelling events, he helped us get started and grow. He has been a teller at IVS concerts since Tellabration 2004. So, if I can find him, there he is. Welcome, Nick Smith.
Well, the story I have for you tonight is both historical and folklore because, well, I have a confession to make. I collect Robin Hood stories, and this was because I became fascinated with the character as a child, but for some reason, I keep stumbling across stories and songs related to Prince John. I even found a Prince John song on my way home from a storytelling concert, but that's not this story. You see, this story is one that I stumbled across as a classical music setting of a folk song, and I learned that the folk song was also around in the form of a story from a long time ago, and it's called Prince John and the Abbott of Canterbury. Now, Prince John in the Robin Hood stories, as you may recall, is not a nice man. From the earliest sources I've been able to track down, that's pretty much accurate. He was not a nice man. In this particular case, though, the Abbot of Canterbury raised donations from all throughout the land and used it to help soldiers coming back from the Crusades. Men at arms, even knights, sometimes stopped at his abbey for a meal or to serve him to help repay the gifts that he had given them. And so it was, he always had a large armed retinue around of warriors who were thankful for his help. Prince John, now King John, did not find this amusing. The idea that a mere abbot would have an armed force of warriors around him and feed them well because of the donations he had received, well, frankly, he was jealous, but being King John, he couldn't admit that. One day, though, he called upon the abbot to come and visit him at the royal palace. And the abbot did so, and he went, and King John said, "I have heard that you richly feed warriors come back from the Crusades. Is this true?" The abbot said, "Yes, money and gifts have been given to the abbey for this purpose." "So you're saying that you are generous, eh?" "Well, I try to be." "And are you suggesting that I am not generous?" Well, the abbot tried to explain that, "No, that's not what I mean. It's just that, well," and King John said, I know. I have a reputation for being a stern man, an unkind man, a man who would take an abbey's land away from it. And I won't do that if you can answer 3 questions for me. These questions are, first, where is the center of the world? Second, how long would it take me to ride a horse around the entire world? And third, what am I thinking? Well, the abbot said, I don't know how to answer questions like that on the spur of the moment. Can you give me some time to figure it out? Yes, said King John. 3 questions, I will give you 3 weeks. If you have answers for me, you will be rewarded with ways to give even more to the soldiers. If you do not answer the questions, you will have an abbey and nothing else. Well, the abbot went back to his abbey and he was very sad. And one of the shepherds who helped raise sheep on the land owned by the abbey saw and came over to talk to him. And the shepherd said, "Abbot, you look so sad. What's wrong?" And the abbot said, "King John has set me an impossible task. He wants 3 questions answered, and I don't know the answers to any of them." And the shepherd said, "Well, tell me what they are. Maybe we can think of something." And so the abbot related the questions to the shepherd. And the shepherd thought and said, "If you can't come up with answers by the end of 3 weeks, let's play a trick on King John, because I think I can figure something out. But I would have to disguise myself as you." "I don't know if that would work," said the abbot, "but I'm willing to try anything." And for 3 weeks, the abbot studied everything in the abbey library to see if he could find an answer to any of the questions. And he could find answers to none. Finally, he went back to the shepherd and said, "Here, borrow a cowl and cloak and go back to the king and see if you can fool him into thinking you're me. And it can't be worse than anything that I can do. I simply have no answers." And the shepherd said, "Let me borrow one of your staves as well." And the abbot gave him a staff for walking along the road, with the cowl pulled over his head and down over his face, and making his best imitation of the abbot's voice. because he thought that King John wouldn't have been listening closely to the abbot anyway, the shepherd walked back to the palace. And there he walked in and said, "The 3 weeks have ended. Let me see if I can answer your questions." And King John said, "Well done, a worthy challenger. All right, where is the center of the world?" And the shepherd, disguised as the abbot, moved forward and struck his staff down on the floor about 3 feet in front of King John's left foot. "Right there," he said. "Right there," said King John. "How can you tell?" "Well, if you doubt me, measure it yourself," said the shepherd. And King John said, "Ha ha ha, a clever answer and a good one. Let's see if you can tell me the next one. How long would it take me to ride a horse around the entire world?" "Oh, that's easy," said the shepherd. "What you have to do is get up early in the morning as the sun rises. Then, as the sun rises up in the sky, ride your horse so that you are always under the sun, and you'll make it in 1 day." But no horse is that fast," said King John. "Well, you didn't say I had to limit it to your horses." And once again, King John had to laugh because this was such an amusing answer. And King John said, "I'll get you on this one, though. What am I thinking?" And the shepherd said, "You are thinking that you're asking questions of the Abbot of Canterbury." And he pulled back his cowl and said, "But I am only his shepherd, sent here to answer the questions in his stead." Well, the rest of the court laughed outrageously because the King John that they knew wouldn't have the sense of humor to appreciate being tricked 3 times, but he was in such a good mood that he thought, "You have tricked me. You have won a prize for yourself as well as the lands of the abbey. Here is a purse of gold coins, but since you are so wise, shouldn't you be the abbot and he the shepherd?" And the shepherd said, "Oh no, my wisdom is the wisdom of the fields, and his is the knowledge of books. We could never trade places and have everyone be happy. But I will take this money back and give it to those who need it more than I, for the sheep provide what I need." And the shepherd went back to the abbey, gave the coins to the abbot, and after that, when warriors came to the abbey to have dinner there and share their tales of the Crusades, not only was the abbot there and the monks, but a shepherd who had been working in the fields. And sometimes he added his own stories, the wisdom of the world. And that is the story of King John and the Abbot of Canterbury.
Thank you, Nick. I'm looking at Robin's thing again, and I can't even unmute her. I'm not sure she's there. Okay, so I guess we'll go on without her. And that brings me up. So my name is John St. Clair, and I'm introducing myself. I'm the leader of the Inland Valley Storytellers, and I'm going to tell you a folk tale from northern India, and it's called The Witch of Kamalalaya. The village of Kamalalaya lay at the foot of the mighty Himalayan mountains. In this village, many years ago, there lived an old woman who the ignorant and superstitious villagers called a witch. But she was not a witch. She didn't have any magical powers, but she did know the ways of healing, and she had more common sense and wisdom than most people do. So the villagers were wary of her. And because of their taunts and slander, she decided to move out of the village and live by herself in the forest. Now, many of the villagers kept sheep, And many of the boys of the village would take care of their family sheep as they grazed in the small valleys and the hillsides nearby. Kierman was one such boy. He took care of his parents' sheep, and he was well known throughout the village as a good shepherd. One day, Kierman took his flock of sheep to an open meadow where the grass was thick and a stream ran at the base of some nearby cliffs. As soon as the sheep saw the lush green grass, they began to graze, and Kierman found a place in the shade to play his flute. Now, usually after the sheep had been grazed and watered, Kierman would count them and then tap his stick loudly to give the signal for them to follow him back to the village. But this day, when he counted the sheep, one was missing. And he knew right away it was one of the little lambs that had been born a couple weeks before. He searched and searched and searched, but he couldn't find the little lamb. And finally, with a heavy heart, he decided to take the flock back to the village. Once he got there and secured the sheep, he told his friends what had happened, and a couple of them volunteered to come with him to search. Well, they had been looking for about an hour before one of the boys saw the little lamb up on top of the cliff, eating contentedly the yellow blossoms that the sheep loved to eat. The boys started to shout and scream and play their flutes and bang their sticks to try to get the attention of the lamb, but it was oblivious and continued eating. Kierman began to cry. He knew how important those sheep were to his family's livelihood. And besides, he loved all the sheep, especially the silly little lambs. He also knew if he didn't get that lamb down off that cliff before nightfall, it might freeze up there, or worse yet, become prey to a wild animal. None of the boys could think of anything until one of them suggested asking the old witch to help. Go to her, Kierman. She can use her magic to get the lamb down off the cliff. That's a wonderful idea, said Kierman. Let's all go and ask her. Oh, no, said the other boys. We don't want to go anywhere near that old witch. She might turn us into something awful. It's your lamb, your problem, you go. And his friends left and went back to the village, leaving Kierman by himself. He looked up at the lamb again on the cliff and noticed that it had stopped eating and now was bleating pitifully. Having finally noticed it was all by itself, far above the meadow where the sheep had been grazing, Kierman decided to risk everything and to save that sheep, and he took off running towards the old woman's hut in the forest. It didn't take him too long to get there, and he knocked on the door and called out, "Mother Witch!" Well, he knocked so hard that the door kind of swung open a little, and he could see the old woman was asleep on the floor, lying on a mat. And so he cried out loudly, "Old Mother Witch, please wake up and help me." The old woman sat up, startled. She was angry at the intrusion, and she was angry at the name that had been used to address her. But when she saw that young boy's tear-streaked face full of fright, the anger quickly faded away, and she said, "What is the matter, my son?" Kierman told her what had happened and asked her to use her magic to get the lamb down off the cliff. The old woman smiled and said, "I don't have any magic, but I think I can help you get the lamb down off the cliff." And she found a rope with a noose on the end and handed that to Kierman and gave him 3 pieces of cloth and said, "You carry these for me and show me where the lamb is." So when they got to the cliff, the old woman looked up at the top, saw the lamb, looked to the left, looked to the right, and she said, "It's obvious to me the lamb did not get up there from here, so we need to find out where the path is that lamb took to get up there." And so they started exploring the base of the cliff, and eventually they found a steep, narrow, windy path that led up. And so the old woman took the rope and cloth from Kierman and said, go up there and see if this is the right way to get up to the lamb. And if you discover that it will take you to the lamb, come back down and I'll give you instructions on how to rescue it. So Kierman went up, and indeed he found that the path led all the way up to the plateau where the cliff was that the lamb was standing. And he came back down and told the old woman that yes, he could get to the lamb. And so she gave him the rope and the cloths back and said, listen to me carefully. You're going to go up there and you're going to slowly approach the lamb so not as to startle it, and try to get it away from the edge of the cliff. As soon as it's safe, put this noose over its neck and secure it so the lamb can't get away. And then take one of the pieces of cloth and use it as a blindfold to cover up the lamb's eyes. Use another one to tie up its two front legs and another one to tie up its two back legs. And then lean down and go underneath and lift up that lamb up onto your shoulders. And use the rest of the rope to secure it to you so it won't fall off. Then you've got to get down that steep path and be very, very careful. You've got to try to ignore the lamb's noises and struggles and focus on finding good footholds and good handholds. And remember, you are a strong and brave boy. And if you focus on the task at hand, you will make it down safely. So Kierman went up and followed the old woman's directions. He picked some yellow blossoms to entice the lamb from the edge of the cliff, put the noose around it, put the blindfold on, tied up its legs, and lifted it up onto his body, on his back and shoulders, and secured the lamb with the rope. And then he went over to the path, and he was scared. It was very steep, and it was very awkward with the lamb on his back, but he remembered what the old woman said about his being strong and brave. And so he focused on getting good footholds and good handholds, and he made it safely down. When he approached the old woman, she helped him take the lamb off of his back, gave him a great big hug, and said, Kierman, you are a brave, strong boy. You're as brave as any soldier in a battlefield. And then the two of them started walking home. It was well after the sun had gone down. It was quite dark before they got back to the village. And all the villagers were safely inside of their homes. Nobody was out and about. And as they approached Kierman's house, he turned to thank the old woman, but she had gone. She had slipped quietly away. And so he put the lamb with the other sheep, went inside, got a big hug from his mother, and he explained all that had happened, including the fact that the woman had helped him not with magic, but with common sense and encouragement. And he said, I'm ashamed of how we have treated that woman. She's not a witch. She's a wise old woman with a kind heart. I'm so ashamed of how we have treated her. Well, the next morning, news spread throughout the village of what had happened. And when Kierman decided he was going to go back to thank her and return the rope and cloth, the other villagers asked if they could go with him too and apologize for the mistreatment that they had given to her. And so most of the village went into the forest, and when they got to the old woman's hut and she answered and he gave her the rope and the cloth, the other villagers joined hands and as a group apologized and asked her if she'd be willing to come back and live in the village. Kierman's mother said they had a spare room in their home that she could sleep in. The old woman was tired of living by herself in the forest and gladly accepted the offer. And so she lived the rest of her years in that village, sharing her wisdom and common sense. And through her simple teachings, she helped many people in the village move away from the dark fears of ignorance, prejudice, and hate, and toward the light of common sense, wisdom, and love. Thank you. So that concludes the stories, unless we hear from, let me go back and check one more time with Robin. I can't even unmute. Okay, so at this point, I'd like, on behalf of the England Valley Storytellers, I'd like to thank everyone who participated tonight, and especially our new friends from Do Tell Story Swap. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And I'm going to stop the recording now, but I have been told